Ketka. The soul should always stand agile, ready to welcome the ecstatic experience. I invite Dr. Fatima Fazana, Assistant Professor of English, to deliver the welcome address.
Knowledge is everywhere, a welcome guest. We must welcome the future, remembering that soon it will be the past. And we must respect the past that it was once, all that was humanly possible. On behalf of the Department of English, I welcome our principal, Dr. S. Ganesh Ram, our beacon of hope and our guiding life. I welcome our head of the department, Dr. R. Sumati, the laurel bow of love and kindness. This historic event would have been impossible if not for our resource people. I humbly welcome the crown jewels of yesterday and today. I welcome Dr. Tarakeshwar, Dr. Kannan, Dr. Joseph, Dr. Sachin, who is going to speak, and Dr. Muthurajan. May your inspiring words move us towards greater achievements to come. I welcome the conveners, Dr. Ajanta and Professor Harish Nirmal and Dr. M. Sudha for their unstinting efforts for making this event a grand success. Finally, the blossoms of the show, the delegates participating and presenting from various institutions, representing various cultures and giving us the hope for future translation. I welcome you and hope we can all take away sparks of motivation from each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fazana. James Madison says, knowledge will forever govern ignorance. A people who mean to their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. With this quote, I would like to read the short bio note of Professor Sachin C. Ketkar. Sir is serving as the Professor of English, Faculty of Arts, the Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda, Gujarat. His areas of research are translation studies, comparative Indian literatures, literary historiography, semiotics of culture, English studies, digital humanities, and travel writing. Sir has been awarded Indian Literature Poetry Translation Prize 2000 by Indian Literature Journal, Sahitya Akademi, New Delhi, for translation of modern Gujarati poetry of Mangal Rato. Professor Sachin C. Ketkar has published his works on Amazon and Paperwall. His poems, translations, and short stories have appeared in many literary periodicals and a reputed journal in New York also. He has published nearly 6 anthologies of poems. His poetry has been read in many literary festivals all across the country and in the college affiliated to Oxford University in the United Kingdom. His translation of poetry published in nearly 30 journals. Sir has also published short story, literary reviews, and 40 research papers in journals. He has been the editor and a reviewer of nearly 6 research journals. His academic and research records need a day to read. We are privileged to have him amidst us today. We request Professor Sachin C. Ketkar to deliver the valedictory address.
Thank you, Dr. Ajanta, for that generous introduction. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers of this very important seminar that you have organized on World Classics in English Translation. And it's my privilege to be with several distinguished speakers and scholars who have gone before me as part of this last valedictory address. I'm not sure how I'm able to sum up whatever has been said, because I don't think that's possible. But in a way, I'm very happy to be in this spot, because most of the important conceptual deliberations around the idea of classic, around the idea of English translation, has been discussed at certain length by distinguished scholars, starting with Dr. Tarakeshwar, who very importantly pointed out how the category of classic itself is a modern category that has been formulated through translation. So translation has played a critical role, especially into English, in formulation of the category of classic itself. Is something that he has dealt with at length, and he has looked at various concepts and various kinds of deliberations around the idea of classic. So I'm not going into that. What I am going to do is I'm going to focus on how to read, how to understand classics, especially from Indian context in English translation, for which I am going to be very specifically looking up a debate that happened over English translations of a very well-known classic, that is a poem by Alama Prabhu, which was translated several times into English, and the scholarly debates around that, and what does that tell us about the whole activity of reading in English, the whole idea of Indian classics. So I'm not going to enter into deliberations around the idea of classics here. I will now straight away go on to my presentation. So I would like to share my screen here. I hope my screen is visible now. Am I visible? Okay. So this is the overview of what I'm going to say today. I will be critically revisiting Tejaswini Niranjana's critique of English translation of Alama Prabhu's Vachana poem. While I broadly agree with her position that she has taken, I argue that her own formulation reveal almost same kind of assumptions that she attributes other translators and other scholars as having. So her own theory and practice seems to suffer from the allegations that she has made against others. So that's a kind of problem that I'm going to touch upon today. And one of the problem is the conceptualization of bhakti as a modern phenomena is a problem that has affected almost all translators of bhakti into English. And she has discussed that. So I will, whenever I go into the details, we'll talk about this. And she reads it as a kind of staging of post-structuralist theory of language somehow. And her own idea of translation and equivalence seem to be influenced by certain Eurocentric models of translation. Again, is something that I will talk about. I will be also looking at translation as a semiotic recodification, to use William Frawley's term, and refraction as the term used by André Lefebvre, which means that it, as a process and as a practice, it happens regardless of whether there is any equivalence or not. So translation need not be tied down to the idea of equivalence, is what they are arguing. And translation always involves recontextualization, refunctionalization in a historically different systemic context. The task of translation studies then is to critically examine the historical specifics of these recontextualization. That is the task for translation studies while we study Indian classics in English translations. And hence the specific strategies and poetics of English translations of Indian classics, itself a modern category, which is to be understood in shifting and historically unfolding context of world Englishes or global spread of Englishes, the ideologies, projects, and the markets of English as a global language, and the idea of world literature in English. In the light of these deliberations, I will read A.K. Ramanujan's Poetics. And I'm sure people must have talked about Ramanujan in the course of 2 days. I'm not sure how much discussion has already gone into it, but if it is not, then we will definitely look at it a bit closely. And my argument is that his own theory, poetics, and practice is part of interliterary process, a term that is advanced by Dionys Gurizin. And Indian classics in English translation, in my view, should be read as part of world interliterary processes and have to be understood in the historically evolving context of world English as given by Braj Kachru and other scholars. So that's the kind of, in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say here. Let me elaborate upon some of these points. So let's look at Tejaswini Niranjana's critique of two translations of this very famous Kannada Vachana. I'm personally, I don't know Kannada, so that's one of my limitations. So I won't be able to throw much light on that. But for me, that lack of knowledge of Kannada itself is very important as a student of Indian classics and English translations, because most of the time we read texts whose original languages we don't know. And then the question for students of translation or students of Indian classics and Indian literature in English translation is how to read this text without referring to the source language text. That remains a challenge for all of us. So the translation one, she points out, is done by Nandimat and Hiremat and others. The second translation is by A.K. Ramanujan from his very famous collection called Speaking of Shiva. And the third is what she has herself provided. So these are the three translations, and there is a transliteration of the earlier Kannada Vachan given here. And some of the people who have critically looked at and countered Tejaswini Niranjana, like Vinay Dharwadkar, point out that she has concealed which source text did Ramanujan actually use, whether it was the same one as Nandimat and Hiremat have used or not, whether she has used or not. So that's one debate that I'm not going into. But these are the three translations. And all these three translations have happened in three different historical periods. The first one is in 60s, mid-60s, second one is mid-70s, and third one is in the mid-90s, early 90s. So these are the three periods in which these three translations have happened. So these are the three translations. I'm not going to read them. Okay, so what is her argument here? What is her critique? She says that the translation A by Nandimat et al. And translation B by Ramanujan fail to understand specific significance inherent in the original, which manifests itself as translatability, citing Walter Benjamin, right? And she says that these translators try to assimilate Shaivite poetry to discourses of Christianity or post-romantic new criticism. They also reproduce some of the 19th century native responses to colonialism. And accepting the premises of a universalist history, they try to show how Vachanas were always already Christian or modernist and therefore worthy of West's attention. So she is basically accusing them of selling it to the Western gallery by draping those translations in Christian, post-romantic, modernist idiom. That's the accusation she is making. The packaging of these things enables them to sell translation to the Western audience is her accusation. And she says their project is supported by asymmetry between English and Kannada. And it's enforced by colonial and neo-colonial discourse. This asymmetry allows translators to simplify text in a predictable direction towards English and the Judeo-Christian tradition and away from multiplicity of indigenous languages and religion, which has to be homogenized before they can be translated. So basically, she's accusing them of homogenization. There is a corresponding stress on similarities between Veerashaivism and European Protestantism in this translation, is what she is talking about. Niranjana's own interpretation of the Vachan, which I'm going to talk about, is that the poem thematizes Allama Prabhu's failure to find figures and languages to communicate his mystic experience. This failure to find language is interpreted by Niranjana in post-structuralist terms. According to her, linga may be said to function in the Vachana as a figure of dissemination and supplement. And these are the key terms in Derrida's philosophical project. And hence authorizes the uses of the term figuration that she herself uses in the last line of her translation of that Vachana. She argues that the literalness, and that's her contention, that literalness as her strategy is an arcade, to use Benjamin's term, and privileging the word over the sentence is a form of displacement. So basically translating literally is a kind of strategy, word by word, is one of the ways to challenge the homogenization and continuous narratives of continuity, and thus attempt to resist containment typical of colonial discourse. That's her argument. So her strategy is also based on very famous theorization of translation given by Walter Benjamin. Then she goes on to cite Paul de Man, and she says that what this whole idea of linga is doing is that it's undoing of the representational and iconic functions of figurations, the play of signifiers, which is indicated by the movement of the linga, which is neither signifier nor signified, that which can move easily from one position to another. So in Jacques Derrida's term, this failure or arrest of articulation is actually triumph of articulation, as his work on Maurice Blashaw talks about. For it's shown to be the linga and death. And again, Benjamin's term mortification or attainment of void is seen as survival and living on. Now this post-structural is an interpretation of not just this Vachana, but entire theological, metaphysical frames or ideas or epistemological paradigms of Veerasaiva Sampradaya is interpreted in post-structuralist terms. Now, this is, I think, the problem here. However, she states that the drive to challenge hegemonic representation of non-Western world, like the Kannada world, need not be coming from a wish to oppose or set up truth against false, because one is already always living in a translated kind of situation. So she's not claiming that her translation is true while others are false. That's not what she is saying. But she says that our search should not be for origins or essences, but far richer complexity, a complication of notion of self, a more densely textured understanding of who we are. Translation from being a containing force is transformed into a disruptive, disseminating one by emphasizing the heterogeneity of it, is what she is trying to claim. Should be the case. My problem with Niranjana's own theory and practice of translation, which is deeply informed by post-structuralist theorization of Benjamin, Paul de Man, and Derrida, is that it assumes that post-structuralism itself is not a Western universalist discourse, and using it somehow overcomes asymmetry between English and Kannada. I have no idea how that happens. I don't understand how Derrida or Benjamin are not Eurocentric or not hegemonic as a discourse in their own right. Besides, as Vinay Dharwadkar in his extended critique of Niranjana's position has noted, theorization of Benjamin and Derrida themselves derive from Judeo-Christian philosophical heritage. For instance, Derrida's own reading of the myth of Babel, or Benjamin's own invocation of Kabbalistic mythology of Ur language and vessel, for instance, show that even these discourses are saturated with the Judeo-Christian philosophy. So how is then Tejaswini Niranjana's position different from Nandimat or A.K. Ramanujan, whom she accuses of being homogenizing in and putting a Judeo-Christian spin on Kannada? That's her accusation against, which applies even to her. Hence, Niranjana's critique of Nandimat et al. And Ramanujan's translation is blind to its own hegemonic subtext and context. And she also tries to assimilate Shaiva's poetics to post-structuralist terminology and promotes the views that Vachanas are always already post-structuralist. As if Allama Prabhu went to the same school as Jacques Derrida went, right? So they are speaking the same language here. Is a kind of assumption that seems to be promoted, which is ridiculous. Niranjana's strategy of word-centric literal translation derived from Walter Benjamin as an attack on hegemonic and continuous narrative is in fact based on very conventional notions of translation as verbal equivalence. Her understanding of translation itself seems to be deeply Eurocentric one. More recent theorizations of translations, as one by André Lefebvre and William Frawley, have demonstrated that translation has never been about verbal equivalence. Lefebvre argues that the understanding of translations, such as Niranjana's, for example, is based on Greek classical notion of word or logos that seems to go back to pre-Socratic, pre-Platonic times. And how it has been integral to Christian metaphysics is something well known. And the romantic notions of literature is the reason why translation is marginal to literary studies. That's what Lefebvre has argued. He also argues that translation is to be understood as a part of larger processes of refraction, where texts are adapted to a different audience with a view of influencing them. So refractions can include, say, for example, cinematic adaptation, web series adaptation, comic books, but also critical commentary, and of course, translations. And all of this is done with some kind of cultural agendas. Studying translation as refraction, according to Lefebvre, allows us to understand underlying contextual, historic, systemic constraints like patronage, ideology, linguistic difference, and so on. Another theorist, William Frawley, has defined translation as a semiotic recodification, where a message from one code, say for example, a traffic signal, is recodified into another existing code like natural language, made of words like word, stop, go slow. So when that happens, it doesn't mean that there is an equivalence there, that the color green and the word go are not really equivalents. They are two different objects. They have nothing in common, right? It's a conventional link that is established between the signifier and the signified in translation. And in process, often producing a hybrid third code, according to Frawley, which incorporates elements from both the codes. So it is something similar to interliterary process, where two cultural idioms, two languages are brought together and a third kind of idiom is produced out of that. So Frawley argues that translation, if it is understood as recodification, happens irrespective of whether there is equivalence or transformation or transfer of information happening at all or not, right? So translation should not be reduced only to the question of equivalence. So there may be no equivalence and still there is translation. This is counterintuitive if we rely on the idea of translation as equivalence. So in the light of all these deliberations, I think it would be interesting now to look at A.K. Ramanujan's own theory and practice of translation. What does he say? And one of the accusations that Vinay Dharwadkar makes against Niranjana is that she doesn't pay attention to Ramanujan's own theory or own conceptualization of translation. She only looks at one poem in isolation from others. And that is why she has this kind of reductive view of Ramanujan as a translator. So in his statement called on translating a Tamil poem, Ramanujan argues that the theory of lays out his own theory of translating Tamil classics. The untranslatable element include not only phonology, grammar, semantics, and left branching of Tamil, something which he discusses referring to Welsh language and poets like Hopkins and Dylan Thomas, who have famously used this left branching aspect of their language, Welsh being close, similar to Tamil in syntactic terms. I'm sorry. But also to the classical Tamil poetics, including genres, metaphors of symbolism, metaphors of flora, fauna, as well as dramatic situations, everything put together, what he calls language within language, or the second language of Tamil poetry, to use his term. So there is, on one hand, there is this natural language, and there is the language of poetry or poetics. So a translator has to try to translate both, which are essentially untranslatable. Hence, classical Tamil poetry should be understood as only as a part of its intertextual universe. Translations, he says, are transpositions, reenactments, interpretation, and nothing less than a poem can translate another poem. Ramanujan therefore selected and arranged a cluster of poems that connect and talk to each other in this very famous translation of Shankam classics, love poetry. The art of arranging these and selecting these according to Ramanujan is something that one can learn not only from Tamil arrangements in the classic anthologies that he has talked about, but also from Yeats, Blake, and Baudelaire. In terms of strategies, he says that using devices of indentation and spacing, he has attempted to mimic closely the syntactic suspense of the left branching Tamil. And English, as all we know, is right branching. And he hopes that it will not estrange the English language so much. So translation is what happens in translation is that if you follow the original closely, you estrange English language. And there is a limit to which you can do. So translation always tries to test these limits of defamiliarizing or estranging English language. In other places, Ramanujan says, English and my disciplines, linguistics, anthropology, give me my outer forms. That is linguistic, metrical, logical, and other ways of shaping experience. And my first 30 years in India, my frequent visits, field trips, my personal and professional preoccupations with Kannada, Tamil classics, and folklore give me my substance of my inner forms, images, and words. They are continuous with each other, and I cannot tell what comes from where. So he is actually drawing upon very famous distinction between Akkam and Puram in Tamil, ancient Tamil poetics. And he is using it to explain his own poetics, where the outer realm comes from the Western scientific disciplines, but it also comes from poetics and the knowledge of literature that he has had from the Western writers. The inner comes from the folk and the Tamil and Kannada classics that one is brought up on. So this kind of dichotomy between Akkam and Puram in classical Tamil poetry is appropriated and recast by Ramanujan to talk about his own sensibility, but also his own poetics. He goes on to say that his own agenda behind translation and in some other place is, in his view, the translations and the afterwords, which make some readers may prefer to read the first, are two parts of one effort. What he's talking about is this paratext, to use Genet's term, those texts which accompany or frame the translations. These paratexts and the notes and the afterwords and the glossary and the maps that he draws can be also understood at what some translation theorists call as thick translations. That's what it's highly annotated kind of translation, and that is one of the important aspects of translating classics. Now, very often I have noticed that if you're reading Kafka in translation, then you don't have so many glossaries or footnotes and explanatory frames, because but if you're translating from Tamil to English, then there is a lot of the thick translation happening. It's as if that we want to explain ourselves so much, right? But when we are trying to understand another text, a German poem in English translation, we don't need those kind of things. So that kind of lack of thickness in the European texts signify the asymmetry between the Indian classics in English translation and European classics in English translation. But coming back to what Ramanujan is saying here, the effort is to try to make non-Tamil readers experience in English something of what a native experiences when he reads classical Tamil poems. Anyone translating a poem into a foreign language is at the same time trying to translate a foreign reader into a native one. So that is his agenda. So what is clear on the basis of this, it's not a simple kind of reduction of Tamil or Kannada texts to modernist idiom or Judo-Christian categories. It's not that simple kind of reduction. What is happening here, in my view, is there are two different domains that are coming together and blending and creating a kind of third register or domain that Indian writing in English, Indian classics in English translation seem to be creating here. Something that can be understood as recodification, as Frawley points out, but also as interliterary process, as Durizin points out. Thus, Ramanujan's own poetics of translation is an interliterary poetics based on negotiation of two spheres of cultural history, revealing a deep engagement with modernist literature of Hopkins, Thomas, Yeats, Baudelaire. This intertextual engagement is not to be understood as influence, or in Niranjana's terms as linear one-dimensional assimilation or reduction of the regional non-English poetics into modernist world literary poetics, but as a kind of interliterary practice and hence a part of world literature. So a bit more about Durizin here. Durizin is critiquing the idea of influence by saying that the whole notion of influence is a kind of vulgarization. And there is one-sidedness implicit in the idea of influence. There is a kind of mechanical understanding of causality, that the idea of influence, as if when you say that X writer has influenced Y, it is a kind of mechanical relation of cause effect that is set up, where the influenced is a kind of passive person without agency, or a passive agent having no agency of his own. So Durizin emphasizes the factors of autonomous individuality of these literary cultures or the receiving cultures here, and the principle of selectivity and agency active in recipient culture. Then Durizin has gone on to formulate his idea of world literature, which is not very widely known in academia, as a dynamic and evolving constructs that models interliterariness at several levels, which in my own research projects I undertake, I find that more constructive framework as compared to other Eurocentric models of world literature like Franco Moretti's one, or Sanskrit-centric neo-Orientalist approaches like Sheldon Pollock's. The idea of world literature that we have evoked just now is something to be thought about. The idea of world literature, as scholars like Chioka and Srivastava note, has become a hegemonic force in English humanities. It is fast becoming the way to theorize any literary field. And in some way, it seems to be a kind of neoliberal kind of project to monopolize all possibilities of international into the global life of capital. And that seems to be the case when we look at the writings of Casanova, who is developing a theory of world literature based on world systems theory. And Franco Moretti, who is basing his idea again on world system theory. And David Damrosch. They are often critiqued for their implication in the notion of capitalist neoliberalism and Eurocentrism. And many people have argued that the world literature idea itself is a new form of colonialism. My argument has been that there is no single thing as world literature. There are various ways of thinking about world literature. Some of them are definitely deeply influenced by neoliberal formulations, but there are other models of world literature as well, which are like ones by Dionys Durizin and David Damrosch, which in my view can be used in literary and cultural historiography of South Asia, as they can provide models for underscoring multiplicity of dialogic processes and textual circulations in wide multilingual and cultural context on South Asia, something that I demonstrate in other places and in my book. So let us look at the idea of Indian classics in English translation as world literature. And Damrosch has famously used the idea of world literature to indicate texts which circulate outside their culture. And he also talks about it's not just text, but also a mode of circulation and of reading. So the methodology or the way of reading, something which we call criticism, is also applicable to the idea of world literature. So if you go back to all three translations that we have evoked, then Niranjana is accusing Nandimat and Ramanujan for being Eurocentric in their approach to translation and interpretation, while she herself claims that she is not, just because she draws upon Derrida and Walter Benjamin and Paul Deman. But Indian classics or Indian literature in English translation is always a mode of reading. And this mode of reading itself has circulation outside of Europe. And when we emphasize circulation in some way, we are provincializing Europe, to use the term used by Dipesh Chakraborty. Thus, Indian classics in English translations are texts circulating outside the culture of their origin in the space that can be called English cosmopolis, and hence part of world literature. Historically, while Nandimat et al. Translation reveals the earlier phase of interliterary world literature, historically, the engagement of translators is with the Victorian Romantic poetics. So the first, if we go back, let's see if I can go back to the previous slides. Then Nandimat translation uses terms like thou and thine, right? Something which is very Victorian and romantic. Ramanujan's translation shows engagement with modernist world literature, something that we have discussed. And Niranjana's own translation reveals her engagement with post-structuralist philosophies, which are also part of those modes of reading, as Damrosch calls it, which are circulating outside the space of their origin as a mode of reading. So the specific strategies and poetics of English translation of Indian classics, itself a modern case, to be understood as shifting and historically unfolding contexts of world Englishes, its ideologies, various projects, and markets of English as global language, and world literature in English. Thus, they should be read as part of world interliterary processes, right? And their contexts are the context of world Englishes as given by Braj Kachru and other scholars. So this is broadly what I wanted to say. I don't know I have tried to be as specific as possible, but in question answer session, I would be very happy to elaborate upon something, because given the restrictions of time, I have limited myself to a very specific area. As this is part of the valedictory session, I think in some way this encapsulates many of the deliberations that have already happened. That's what I hope. And maybe a kind of, what should I say? In a nutshell, it touches upon many of the ideas that the other distinguished scholars and paper presenters have formulated. So with this, I want to end my presentation, but I want to thank again the organizers of the college and Dr. Ajanta in particular. And I also want to congratulate the college for organizing this very important seminar, because as Indian writing in English seems to be growing, and there is greater space now available for Indian texts in English translation in our English studies discipline. How to study them remains a very important question. As English studies as a discipline moves away from the classical colonial positions and frames, it has incorporated more comparative approaches through theory of various kinds, as well as theories like post-colonialism and so on and so forth. But he is also incorporating a massive amount of Indian literary texts in English translations. Dalit studies has made an important inroads into our academia. And also these classics or those texts which have stood the test of time, for instance, one of the ways in which we look at classics, is making greater inroads into our academia. Such kind of organizing such kind of seminars will go a long way in providing certain methods or raising certain important issues that we have to face as students of these texts and researchers of this text. So I think this is a very timely seminar, and I want to congratulate the organizers for this. So I think my presentation ends here, and I will be very happy to respond to questions.
Thank you, sir, for your valuable insights on the theme of the conference and your enlightening session. There is a question in our chat, sir, from Professor Viraj Desai. He would like to ask you to elaborate some further upon the idea of the hybrid third in terms of their relationship to the target language and the source language. Can the prominent practice of thick translation in Indian languages, for example, Tamil in this instance, be seen as an effort towards decolonization?
Thank you for that question, very important one. The hybrid third idea is promoted by William Frawley in his theory of translation as recodification. And he has argued that translation very often does not remain, when you translate Gujarati into English, the language that you end up making in your translation moves away from English as well. There is certain Gujaratification of English that is happening. At the same time, there is some sort of Anglicization of Gujarati idiom is happening as well. So it creates a third code, and translation, he says, is this third hybrid code. So it's basically innovative. It is basically a creative act where you are creating a third language out of two. And those people who are familiar with this, who have translated things on their own, how it happens. For example, again, going back to Ramanujan's idea here and a strategy he has used, because Tamil is a left branching language and English is right branching language. What we mean by that is when I say, I am a teacher from Baroda, this is what we mean by right branching language. But in Gujarati, it would be Baroda College ma hu bhanavu chu, adhyapak chu. So it becomes what is object place becomes on the other side in Indian languages. Now, when you translate, what happens that if you're playing around as you do in poetry with the word order, there are certain elements which you cannot capture in English. So he has taken certain liberties to distort the natural word order of English in his translations of Tamil poems. That's what he's saying, to create a different kind of impact. So he is creating something which is neither Tamil nor English, right? It's a third kind of idiom that Ramanujan is creating. And in my view, that is also an instance of interliterary third core. Two literatures come together and form a third literature. That's how it works in Durisinian frame. So that's about the third code. You can read Frawley's essay called Prolegomena to Theory of Translation. That's available in the earlier edition of Venuti Reader, Translation Studies Reader by Venuti, 2000 edition. And the second question is about thick translation. And the example I gave, I think, is in contrast to the question you are asking. Because I felt that when you read Ulysses, or if you read Thomas Mann in translation, they don't give you so much of packing, right? You are supposed to understand it on your own. But while we are translating from Tamil, we need all sorts of glossaries and footnotes and preface and introductions and afterwords. So it seems that it's not decolonization, but recolonization, because we are eager to explain our culture to the left, to the Western audience, the Western markets. While Western market doesn't feel it necessary to explain their culture to us, we are supposed to find out on our own. So I think it's not very decolonizing. Okay. What are the other questions?
So there is a second question from one participant. What are the important things to keep in mind while translating?
We make a distinction between translation as a practice, right? Something that you do. But right now we are not doing that. We are studying translation as a product here, right? Translation as a practice and as a process, you have to keep so many things in mind. What I feel is that when you translate from your languages to English, you should not know 2 languages properly. You should know 4 languages properly. Suppose if your first language is Tamil or Malayalam, you're translating into English, then you should know 4 languages. One is the natural language, Malayalam. Second is another natural language, English, but also the language and register of those genres. So if you're translating a news report from Tamil to English, then you should also know the language or register of news report, right? So you should know the language of the form as well as natural language when you are translating. That's the tip. So that makes it 4 language. That's quite challenging, right? That is what you have to keep in mind.
The next question is how to translate emotions and feelings, especially in poetry.
That's a tough question. We can only interpret and recreate emotions, right? And emotions are also very language specific and context specific. So what we can do is, we can, as again going back to what Ramanujan said, that only a poem can translate another poem. So you can recreate those emotions, which may not be similar, but we should also be careful in looking at the questions of loss and gain. It's not the loss of the original emotions that is happening, but creation of new emotions in another language that is happening. So translation is the way by which you create new emotions, right? It's a creative activity. You're not taking away emotions from the Tamil poem, but you are adding English emotions to it, right? So that's what we have to bear in mind.
Our next question is from Dr. Sikandis Jason Grasata. Whether translation or adaptation, which appeals more to people?
I think adaptations are made with an eye on specific kind of wider market. right? So when you adapt, you're looking for a broader market. And when you translate, you're looking for a smaller market of literary texts. Adaptations, especially in, say, for example, cinematic or visual format, have a wider audience because that's more popular form. So I think adaptation is one of the ways by which you popularize something. So I feel that adaptations are made with that intention of having a wider market, and that because they appeal to people more. Yeah.
There is another question from Professor Pranjal Bhatt. What should we consider graphic portrayals of a certain text to be translation or adaptation of the oral or written ancient texts such as Adi Parva or Vyasa of Mahabharata?
What should we consider graphic portrayals as a? I didn't get the question very clearly. If I think she can say something more about her question, if she unmutes herself or if she types, I don't know. Because I am trying to figure out what she is asking.
Just a minute, sir. I will try to unmute her.
Okay.
Hello, good afternoon, sir.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to questioning. Sir, my question was, should we understand graphic portrayals or visual translation to be one of the translations of the ancient text, or is it an adaptation? Can we read it as translation or an adaptation of the ancient text?
Again, distinction between translation and adaptation is, I think, if you understand both as refractions, right? As I said, the term that I used drawing upon Lefebvre is refraction, which is adaptation or rewriting of a text for different audience with a different agenda in mind. Then both translations and adaptations can be understood as refractions, right? So if you are looking at portrayal of Mahabharata in a graphic novel format, right, that is certainly not translation in the narrow sense of the word, but it is still definitely refraction, right? So the mechanisms are similar even then, underlying mechanism. So because graphic novels has a different audience and different language, right? And the graphic novel makers, writers have a different agenda from Ved Vyasa and Valmiki. So these are two different texts, so we should analyze that in a different way. So we should not look at translation in a very narrow sense of the word, right? We are trying to look at translation as a broader phenomena which goes beyond equivalence. In such a situation, this is translation, right? But in narrow sense of the word, it is adaptation. Broader sense of the word, it is translation. Okay. I don't know if I'm clear here.
Yes, sir, definitely. I understood. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that question.
Sir, another question from Professor Balakrishnan. Is it possible to compare narrative technique and a translation poetry?
Again, I didn't get the question. What is translation poetry? Means, are you talking about techniques of translating a narrative versus techniques of translating poetry? Is that the question? What's the question here?
Yeah, I'm trying to unmute him.
Yeah.
He is not responding actually.
Okay, but if this interpretation which I am making is right, that he is asking whether we can compare the strategies of translating a narrative with the strategies of translating poetry, then I feel that poetry is also a form of narrative, right? With different narrative techniques. So poetry and novel are different in terms of techniques, but they are both narratives. So we have to take on board the differences in techniques, differences in strategies of narration in a poem as well as in a short story or a novel. They have different strategies of narrating, right? And when you translate, you can translate. And while it comes to question of translation, we have to find similar translational strategies in other languages. So if you're translating poem, then you have to look for those strategies through which poetry is narrated, right? And if you're translating a short stories, then you have to look at narrative strategies of a short story. And you have to find similar strategies in the target language.
So there is another question.
Yeah.
Anything in thread, that is translation itself. In modern era, machine translation is great threat to this. Can you please throw some light on this important question?
I don't see it as a threat. You have to understand what it is. I see it as a tool, right? As a technology, and technology cannot replace human intelligence. Means you may use the extremely advanced form of quantum computing, but still you will require human beings. So the machine-aided translation or translation and AI, for examples, are upcoming areas of translation studies where you have to understand that it's not, we should not be so Luddites. I don't know if that term makes sense. Technology is beneficial, right? If you're going to use it for good thing. And I feel that machine translations save labor a lot. After all, that's what tools are for. And you cannot translate literature using Google Translate, but you can definitely save a lot of time translating a manual or a news report or a prose text, a legal text using Google Translate, which is based on extremely advanced artificial intelligence tools, right? It is something called deep neural network, where it mimics human brain neural patterns of its, and that's why it almost self-learning. So more you use Google Translate, more accurate it becomes. So the early translation from, say, for example, Gujarati may not give very accurate results. But if people from Tamil Nadu use it, it will give better results because more Tamilians use Google Translate. So it's a self-learning tool. It's a tool which learns on its own, right? And if you're translating from French to English, it becomes highly accurate compared to Tamil to English. So we have to keep in mind that technology is to save labor, right? It cannot replace human intelligence. So if we take it for what it is, I don't see it's a bad thing in itself. It's a boon, right? Nuclear technology can be boon as well as a bomb. It depends on how you use it. So in itself, it's not harmful. That's what I feel. Nowadays, you also have those earphones, I think brought out by Google, where you can go when you're going to France and somebody is using French and it will translate it for you. Right? You don't know French. So that's fairly advanced technologies. And I'm sure the advances are always beneficial to us. So I welcome machine translations.
So there is another question from Nazisha Naran. Can we say that any translation is always an act of creation?
Yeah, it is. That's what I meant when I say it's a recodification where a third hybrid code is created, right? It's always creates a new language. So it's always a creative, innovative act, to use Frawley's word. It's an act of innovation. Translation is essentially an innovation.
Yes, another question from Dr. Sonia Shada. How much you think translations from original text is possible? Is it possible to translate our original text from other languages?
Yes, it is possible. All text can be translated. Right? If you are saying that can those texts be replicated as they are in other languages, that's never going to happen. But translation as a form of rewriting, you can rewrite any text, and no text is essentially untranslatable. You have to use various strategies. And I would refer to an essay, famous essay by Roman Jakobson, who talks about the 3 modes through which any sign can be interpreted into another language. It can be intralingual, interlingual, or intersemiotic. So you can use any of the languages to interpret another language. So all translation is possible. But you have to look at what do you mean by translation in the first place.
Yes, another question is from Sonali. What are the 3 most factors which controls the process of translation?
The language. is the first important constraint. I'm just summarizing Andre Lefebvre, right? Language is the first constraint. Second is poetics. And the third is patronage. That means the ideology of your people who buy your books, right? You cannot offend them beyond a point. So censorship is inbuilt into translation, right? So that's what he seems to be saying. So these are the three constraints, and constraints is the word that we have to keep in mind while we translate. So these are the three challenges that we face as a translator.
Another question from Pradeep Raj. How would you react to Eliot's idea of objective correlative with respect to poetry translation?
Idea of objective correlative was not used in the context of poetry translation by Eliot. Eliot is using it as a technique of poetic expression in his famous discussion on Hamlet. So he's not really talking about translation. I'm not sure, but if he means symbolism, and that's what probably Eliot is hinting at, then translation also involves symbolism and interpretation, right? So because after all, you're translating language, which is essentially symbolic. So this kind of comparison to me would look very far-fetched, but not impossible. You can make it. I would be interested in why you would want to make such kind of comparisons. Rather, whether such comparisons are possible or not is not such an important question for me. But it's not directly connected to translation. So thanks for that interesting question. Makes you think outside the box.
Another question from Sonia Chada. How do, as a reader, we come to know that the translated work is correct, or how authentic it is that the text which we used to which is translated in English?
It's again a very interesting question, but I'm interested in when you ask that question. When you are translating from Tamil, you ask this question, but if you are reading a translation from German, you don't ask questions. How authentic is that, right? So very often this question comes from a belief or an assumption that translation is in some way going away from the original, which is authentic, right? Translation in itself has a questionable relation to authenticity. So this assumption from which this question Sonia Chadda is asking is something that we question all the time. What is the proof that original itself is not a derivative one? Shakespeare took his material from all over the world. Kalidas took his material from Mahabharata, right? And almost all plays by Bhas are based on Mahabharata stories, right? You take your material from somewhere else and you make your own stuff. What do we even mean by authentic original? And what is the guarantee that original is authentic, right? So the whole idea of authenticity that we unquestionably attribute to original is also a problem. I'm reversing your question. How do we come to know that the original is always authentic? That's my reverse question to you, right? Original, somebody said, I think it was Borges, who says that original, it's the job of original, duty of the original to remain faithful to translation. It's not the job of translation to remain faithful to the original. Yeah.
Another thing, the final one is from Dr. Padikra again. He has actually elaborated his question. How do you react to Eliot's idea of objective correlative with respect to poetry translation? And it goes like, I mean the formula for evoking a particular emotion in one language is caught up in a web of latent significations and connotative meanings. Now, translation into another language will involve forging a totally different formula.
Yeah, completely. Means, look, say objective correlative, idea of objective correlative comes from Eliot's own symbolist poetics, right? He draws from Mallarmé and others, Rimbaud and others, the whole symbolist movement in arts, which has influenced Eliot. So what he's talking about, that these objective symbols are symbols which evoke meaning in particular culture, right? So in translation, you have to find equivalent symbols which will evoke equivalent feelings. That's what, how, if we displace Eliot's objective correlative to translation theory. So basically you are looking at the signifiers for emotions, which communicate those emotions, right? But I believe that emotions are also deeply cultural, and you can never have equivalents in another culture to a particular emotion, right? There would be so many emotional expressions in your own languages which don't have equivalent in another languages. Now, what does that mean? I believe that even if there are no equivalents, translations can happen. We have to look beyond translation as equivalent. And you will see that if you use objective correlative to, as Ramanujan is using probably, right? He's talking of Akkam and Puram and all those landscapes and those flowers and the situations of love and war. Now, they don't have equivalents in English, right? But when you bring them in, there is a new kind of emotional connotationality that it seems to gather, and it seems to become a new text, right? Rather than, so it's a search for objective correlative to, if objective correlative one is specific to your culture and language, like Kurinchi flower that Ramanujan talks about, right? It does not have any emotional meaning in English. It does not have any meaning in English. But then daffodils also don't have any meanings for us. But then we create emotional response to it, right? So I think it's the domain of creativity and inventing new emotions that translation makes possible, provided we look at translation as something much more than equivalences. That's the overall argument about translation that I'm trying to make. I don't know how much it responds to Dr. Roy's question, but this is my take on this question. But thank you for those interesting questions.
So the final question from Zanita Srivastava. Does sometimes translation get better than original one?
Translations are always better than the originals. How does that sound? Because no translations, you would never read those texts. So even bad translations are better than no translations at all. Because good, bad, right, wrong are all judgments, which are which are expression of our values, and values change. So something may be bad in particular period, in historical period, in a particular culture, may not be bad in another culture. So till yesterday, a kind of thing would be considered, consumerism was bad when I was very young. But today it's how people live their life, right? So middle class values have changed. So what is good and bad changes with time. So that's for me not a very interesting question. For me, what work does translation do is more important question. What does it reveal about the cultural history is what is important than judging whether a translation is better than the original, right? So this judgmentality often becomes a barrier in our research. So we have to be very careful in judging translation, because it's easy to judge translation as it's easy to judge women, as feminist translation theorists have pointed out. So we should be wary of this judgment. We should be careful, think through these judgmentalities all the time.
Thank you, sir, for your enormous energy and inspiration in enlightening the session. You have taken the session, you have taken the event to greater levels where passion is speech. Your remarks triggered with new ideas that will benefit our academic and research pursuit for years to come. We will be looking forward to having more of your presence in our future events, sir.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And thanks for that very interesting question answer session. It was always enlightening. It makes you think and develop a response. So I want to thank Sri S. Ramaswamy Naidu Memorial College for having me on this in their conference. Thank you. And congratulations for that seminar as well.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Showing gratitude is one of the simplest yet most powerful things humans can do to each other. I request Mr. Dr. M. Sudhadevi to propose the vote of thanks.
Good afternoon. Jubilantly, we have come to the end of the program. It's a privilege and a great joy for me to extend out of thanks to all those who have contributed in one way or the other to make this e-conference a successful one. The essence of all beautiful art, all great art is gratitude. First of all, I would like to express my deep gratitude to our management for giving us this wonderful opportunity to work under its shade in association with Sahitya Academy, New Delhi, a two-day national conference on world classics in English translation, a critical perspective. Honestly, I have no words strong enough to express my gratitude to our principal, Dr. S. Ganeshram, for his constant support and encouragement at every point of time in the organization of this great event. All this would have been impossible without the generous support of Dr. R. Sumati, our beloved head, Department of English. I recognize with gratitude her significant contribution. The two voyagers of this e-conference are none other than the organizing secretaries, Dr. Ajanta Parthasarathy and Mr. Harish Nirmal. I would like to appreciate and thank them from my bottom of my heart for their high-tech design and visualization. I sincerely thank our chief guest, Dr. Tarakeshwar BB, Professor, Department of Translation Studies, the English and Foreign Language University, Hyderabad. Dr. K. Kannan Prasad, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Loyola College, Chennai. Dr. Joseph Koipali, Head and Associate Professor, Department of English. Koipali, Department of English and Comparative Literature, Central University of Kerala. Dr. M. Nilangovan, Associate Professor, Department of English, Tyagaraja College, Madurai. Dr. K. Muthurajan, Associate Professor, Department of English, VHN SN College, Virudunagar. Dr. Sachin C. Ketkar, Professor, Department of English, Faculty of Arts, the Maharaja Sairachio University of Baroda, Gujarat, for accepting our invitation to be the chief guest for the second day sessions and also for the valedictory function. They shared with us their expertise knowledge. I would like to thank advisory committee members, Professor Jagdish Sharma, School of Translation Studies, IGNOU, New Delhi. Dr. M. Chandrasekharan, former head Department of English, Sri S. R&M College, Satur. Dr. A. Ram Subbayar, Assistant Professor of English, IQAC and NAC Director, Mannar Tirumala Nayak College, Madurai. Deeply thanking the chairpersons from other colleges, Dr. Rati, Assistant Professor of English from MTN College, Madurai. Dr. Ram Prasad, Assistant Professor of English, Saurashtra College, Madurai. And our own college, Dr. Smati, Head Department of English, Dr. Fatima, Dr. Mariktai, who are Assistant Professor of English. I also thank the paper presenters of our, from our country and also other parts of the country across the world. The interest and the enthusiasm you have shown is indeed a good sign for the future. I once again thank everyone whose contribution has made this e-conference a successful one. Thank you very much. The certificates, here is an important announcement. The certificates will be sent to your email ID on or before 14 February 2021. Your queries will be answered by our team. Thank you very much.
Thank you.